should I be sharing this with other folks in the future. If you yourself would like, after today's webinar, a copy of this webinar recording to share with other folks at your institution, I encourage you just to email me directly and I'll be happy to send that link to you. As well as many of you know, in the past we've had some issues with some feedback, so if you are working also with a tablet or iPad or even on your phone throughout this presentation, I ask that you keep it away from the computer in particular, as it will create some issues, has created issues with feedback in the past during the presentation. If you have not pulled up the chat room on your participant side, I encourage you to do so. I know Nancy will be asking questions during the presentation and asking you to respond to those, her questions via the chat room. It's also a great place for you to pose questions for our presenter to answer at various times throughout the presentation. So if you have a question during the presentation, don't hesitate to enter that into the chat room. You can send it directly to me, Carrie Fuller, or just send it to everybody, and I'll be sure to make to relay those to Nancy at those appointed times throughout her presentation. And then finally, one last reminder that there were some handouts that she provided prior to the webinar. If you have not downloaded those or pulled those up on your computer, you can do so at the same place. They're located at the same place where the link to today's webinar is on the ODHE website. She will be using those throughout the presentation today, so hopefully you have those in hand. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Nancy Grigsby, who's the Legal Program Director at the Ohio Domestic Violence Network. Nancy?
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining this webinar. And one thing I wanted to do just to start, if you don't mind using the chat box, is just to tell me what your role is at your school or institution, just so I get a sense about the various settings that you're working in. So if you just hover on the screen with your mouse and you'll see a little chat icon, and that'll open up the chat box. And just, if you don't mind telling me what you do at your school, that'd help me. Just be sure that we're addressing everybody's sort of context. And with that, Carrie, we can go ahead and dive in. So one of the things I wanted to start with was just this idea about evaluating danger and risk. And as you all know, we've had more than one homicide, domestic violence homicide on a campus in Ohio. There was one in Pennsylvania last week. And this is I think it's a really hard topic, and I think it's a hard topic to do by webinar, so I'm just really glad that you took the time to participate today. And I want to start by saying that I think the purpose of this conversation today is I'm getting a little background noise. The purpose of today is really to acknowledge what we can and can't do, and none of us individually can stop a homicide from happening, but all of us can help move a survivor closer to safety, and so that's really, the goal. Today, we're going to talk about one case, one real homicide, and also go through the data, the science. But the research is still pretty young on predicting homicide and fatality. There's no scorecard that you can use on these factors that we're going to talk about today. What we can do is really look for clusters of these factors, and we can listen for the details when we are talking to somebody who's sharing their domestic violence experiences with us. But our intuition really counts, and we should listen to it because in addition to the data and what we know, sometimes a gut feeling about our concerns for a survivor, is one of the strongest tools we have in our toolbox. So next I want to go over some sources of the data that I'm going to share with you today. So there's lots of different people around the country who are working hard to try to understand how to predict danger in these cases, and it is a hard thing to predict, but I want to share a couple of websites in case you're inclined to look further into this after today's session. The first one is the National Domestic Violence Fatality Review Initiative. This is a treasure trove of data and reports from all around the country of communities who are sitting down and doing what we call fatality reviews. So after there has been a domestic violence homicide, these are multidisciplinary teams in cities, counties, college settings, health departments. They're rooted in lots of different places, who are really sitting down and doing an analysis of the factors to try to learn what they can from homicides that they're reviewing. And so you can click on those states and look at any number of reports. And the data there is not only what we can learn about the homicides. Many communities are also talking about what kinds of reforms, what kinds of systems change is needed to help people be safer. The next slide highlights one such report. I might be a little partial to this one because I helped create the Fatality Review Project in Georgia when I lived there. But it's a great example of a good, solid report where they're discussing not only, this report is actually aggregate data over, I think, about 10 years now of reviews, where they're talking about factors that they've discovered, nuances, as well as what are some things that everybody in every system can do, whether it's, higher education, faith settings, mental health settings, et cetera. So this is a great example of a specific fatality review report that might be useful to give you a flavor. The next resource is a website called Danger Assessment. This is the work of Dr. Jacqueline Campbell, who has done most of the prominent research in the area of fatality review and homicide risk. There is a scoring process to the tool that Dr. Campbell has developed, but she would caution all of us that, a number isn't really the point. The point is really to flag some things about the abuse pattern that might really help us spot a dangerous situation. So that's a great resource. The next resource I just want to highlight for you is the work of David Adams. David is an expert on batterers. He's been working with batterers for many decades at one of the first batterer programs in the country in Boston called Emerge. And David went into men's prisons and interviewed men who had completed homicides of their partners. He also interviewed about 20 women who survived attempted homicides. These were mostly shootings and stabbings. And he did qualitative research based on those interviews with both sets of people and really brought to light some new dynamics and new nuances in our understanding. So this is a great resource. The last resource I want to sort of highlight for you is one from Canada. This is the Ontario Domestic Assault Risk Assessment. This is a tool that I believe came out of their criminal court system, and it's intended to predict future serious assault as well as homicide. So it's another resource. And there are others out there. These are the ones that we put the most stock in. And so just to give you a sense about where the data is coming from and who some of the people are who are thinking about how we can spot these cases and promote safety. So I want to move now to a case. I want to start with this case, and then after we finish the conversation about this case, then I'll present some of the research. But I want to start with the life and death of Christy Bice. Christy was an Ohio resident who was killed by her husband in 2016 in Northeast Ohio. I want to honor her life. She was a survivor. She survived domestic violence for many years, and she made the decision to end the relationship, and she did a lot of things. She struggled and really sought safety and fought to live, and unfortunately she was killed by her husband. There are some important lessons we can learn from what happened to Christy Bice, and also the dynamics in her particular battering are really classic in terms of some of the signs and symptoms that we see when we're hearing survivors talk about what's happening to them. This is sort of a textbook case, unfortunately, of lots and lots and lots of danger signs, and frankly, lots of them that were missed. So we're going to turn to a Cleveland.com article that I provided to you all. The slide I have here, this is Christy Bice's house. This is the homicide scene, and you see now that the county is, lots of law enforcement involved on the day she died. Not so much law enforcement before she died, and that's really one of the one of the lessons in this case is that putting all these resources to homicides, which is what we tend to do, doesn't get us where we want to go. She needed this many cruisers in her driveway when he was threatening to kill her. And so we want to move all of us forward in marshaling as many resources as we can. So if you would take a minute to look at the Cleveland.com article, I want to give us about 2 minutes to just read through. There are 2 articles here. It's the second one, the second article that is titled, Hudson Man Suspected in Murder-Suicide Previously Threatened to Shoot Wife. If you don't have access to that document for some reason, if you're having trouble downloading it, give us a sign there in the chat box. Otherwise, what I'd like us to do is if you would just take 2 minutes and jot down, think about reading this story, think about this story coming to you from somebody who was actually telling you about their situation in their relationship, and jot down the things that seem like red flags to you that indicate some risk of this getting much more serious. Now, let's just do about 2 minutes of silence and give you a minute to read the second article titled Hudson Man Suspected in Murder-Suicide, and just jot down your notes about some of the red flags you see here. So one of the limitations of a webinar is I cannot see you. If we were in a room together, I would see people's heads popping up. So I don't know if everyone has had a chance to finish reading this article. But if you saw some red flags in this article, would you throw a couple, maybe your top 2 or 3 in the chat box? What are some things that you saw in this account of this homicide that stand out as red flags to you? You can just type them in the chat box. So I'm not seeing any content in the chat box yet. Are people still reading, or I want to get a couple of your thoughts before I move on to starting to talk about the data. Okay, there goes some thoughts. So threats, firing the gun in advance, having the gun, hiding the gun. Discharging the gun outside of her home, being an alcoholic, having a gun when he shouldn't have. Okay, all right. Well, one of the reasons, and you can continue if other red flags are sort of occurring to you, you can type them into the chat box. One of the reasons I like starting with this case is to just sort of root this conversation in the life of this particular survivor and in her death, and to just sort of confront, you know, if we'll go to the next slide, Carrie, to confront sort of the hard truth, which is that we can only do our best. You know, we can't, and I mentioned that I hoped we would have had more law enforcement response earlier in this case, but we really can't blame the police. We can't blame the courts. We can't, when people decide they're going to commit a homicide, it is very hard to stop them at that point. But all of us, as we're having contact with abusers and with survivors, can do our best to try to recognize when we're involved in a very dangerous case, and to try to intervene in the most effective way possible. The other reason I like doing that case in advance is to just sort of help us see that already we see some stuff that is making us uncomfortable about this case, and to just really underscore our intuition. So let's talk about what we know about risks of danger in these cases. I organize these into 5 categories. Lots of people do it lots of different ways. I'm a Virgo, so I prefer, you know, charts and buckets, and so that's the way I think about them, and that's the way I'm going to sort of present them to you and organize this. So the first is the history of abuse and threats, which we'll talk about. The other is the abuser's mental state, failed intervention, separation, and survivor factors. And so we're going to, as we look at the next slide, which has sort of this chart, which is also an attachment that you can print later, we're going to sort of fill this in one by one. And our first discussion is going to be looking at the history of violence. So I'm going to run through the factors that we sort of understand now to have a pretty significant predictive value. One of the first is threats to harm or kill. So, and again, I'm going to underscore trusting your intuition a lot here, because this one is pretty common sense, and a lot of these are pretty common sense. So when people are talking about what they're going to do, like Steve Bice did, sometimes that tells you exactly what they're going to do. And so when somebody says, I'm going to kill you, we can start to identify that case easily as one that has a high risk. And so we see here that David Adams found a 500% or 5-fold higher risk among the guys that he talked to who said that they had made a threat to kill before they actually did the act. And I noticed some of you are advocates and Title IX folks, and maybe actually intervening with students around lots of issues. We can think about threats to kill in the same way we might be talking to somebody who's thinking about hurting themselves, and that's to really listen to the threat. So we want to listen to how specific it is. We want to listen, in the case of homicide risk, for how specific the threat is around how the homicide would happen, when it would happen, and where it would happen. And this, in the Bice case, he did make a threat to kill, but he made a threat to kill her by shooting, and so he had already decided how he was going to do it. So the more specific the threat is about how, when, or where, the more we should be concerned. I remember working on a case with a woman whose abuser was very jealous of the attention she paid to her horse. She had a horse, and they had a barn behind the house, and he often told her, I'm going to kill you someday, and I'm going to bury you in that stall, and your horse is going to stand on your grave. and he did, in fact, kill her in that barn. And so he was thinking about more than just his desire to kill her, but he was starting to think about where and how. We want to listen for intent. Obviously, it's different if somebody says, I will kill you, then I feel like killing you, or I ought to kill you. People having access to the means. So, again, the analogy with suicide would be if somebody says, I'm thinking about overdosing and I already have a bottle of pills sitting in front of me, obviously they're more serious about it. And the same is true for homicides. And in the Bice case, we notice his gun was taken away from him by the police when he was arrested in January on that domestic violence case. But then we notice that his friend calls her, I think, later in, within a couple of days, his friend calls her back and says, hey, he's on his way to a gun show. So he's getting new access to means. And the recent acquisition of a gun is obviously a big red flag. People who've thought about the consequences. So I remember a case I worked on where the police had responded earlier to an earlier incident, and the guy had thought he had disconnected the phone when one of the kids called 911. He ripped the phone out of the wall, but he didn't disconnect the call, and that was in February. And in that instance, he killed her in July. But in the February call, he's raging and yelling and screaming until the police get there, and then he's very calm. But he says to her, if I'm going to go to jail, I'm going to go to jail for a reason. So again, when somebody's starting to think about the consequences of the act, we have to understand that they're quite serious about it. And finally, if the victim believes the threat, then we can usually rely on that assessment. Some other factors that we want to listen for are child abuse. Both Jackie Campbell and David Adams found in their research that child abuse, while it co-occurs with domestic violence a lot, is another red flag for homicide. So people who are abusing their kids have a higher rate of attempting or completing homicides of their partners. Abuse during pregnancy is another factor. So you see here it's a fourfold risk. It's a high risk. So people who are abusing their partner during pregnancy are more likely to commit a homicide than those who do not abuse their partner during pregnancy. Sexual assault, which is very common in domestic violence situations, still Jackie Campbell had statistically significant predictive value. So she found that it was correlated beyond chance in terms of predicting risk of homicide. The next one is choking or strangulation. A lot of people will say the word choking, and in fact it is strangulation. This one is one of the biggest ones. Other than separation, it is the biggest one. You see here a 700% or a sevenfold associated risk with a completed attempted homicide or completed homicide. And this is the research of Nancy Glass and Jackie Campbell. And so one of the things we want to be careful about with strangulation is to not make it be the litmus test, which I fear it is going to become, because there are a lot of people who were never strangled who were killed. But when we hear about strangulation, we must really understand that we are now interacting with somebody who has a much higher risk of death. There are some things about strangulation I just want to note for you. You can decide whether you want to correct a survivor about their language. It's important that if they're using the word choking, it's important that they understand the intent of the act. I think usually they do. One important piece for us to understand as responders is that strangulation can be fatal during the assault. It can also be fatal within 72 hours after the strangulation. So we have some work to do when we're talking to somebody who's been strangled. We have to find out a little bit more about it. So when we are talking to somebody and they say that there's strangulation in their abuse history, one question we have to ask is, when did it happen? If it happened in the last 72 hours, then we've got to get that person screened. Here are some other things that indicate that a strangulation event is on the severe side. And again, some of this is really common sense, even for those of us like me who don't have any medical training. And if you have a chance and are interested in strangulation and understanding it better, we have a wonderful forensic nurse in Ohio, Ruth Downing, who several times a year will offer a day-long training for law enforcement attorneys, advocates, and others on strangulation. So by the time strangulation is leaving marks on the neck, most strangulation does not, so we're already in the territory of quite a bit of oxygen loss. If the survivor has coughed blood, that means we've got some injury to the throat, to the capillaries or arteries in the throat. If we have bloodshot eyes or red spots on the face, neck, eyelids, ears, or scalp, all of those are indicators that capillaries have burst because the blood pressure from the strangulation has gotten so high that the blood has nowhere to go and those capillaries are breaking. And so those are particularly, those are big red flags. Some survivors have personality change after strangulation events, possibly due to brain damage. If our survivor is telling us that they have lost consciousness or lost control of their bladder or bowels, what we know about that level of strangulation is that the brain no longer has enough oxygen to function. It cannot keep us awake anymore. It cannot control the automatic, function that it does to hold our waste in our body. I mean, it is, those events are near-death experiences. So all strangulation is dangerous. All strangulation predicts homicide. This level of strangulation indicates a possible medical emergency and certainly a severity of strangulation that would be of extra concern. So if you talk to a survivor and you find that they're talking with you about strangulation, we want them to go get a medical follow-up. We want them, particularly within 72 hours, we just have to urge them to go. We have had at least one death in a domestic violence shelter of a woman who had been strangled that evening and was exhausted, had been up for over 24 hours and simply fell asleep before she went to the emergency room, and she passed away in her sleep as her throat continued to swell. So it is definitely a possibility that you would save a life just by intervening in a strangulation event and getting somebody to care. Definitely for sure, if somebody's having trouble breathing or swallowing or their neck is visibly swollen, we definitely are just in an emergency situation. They've got to go. So that's just a piece on strangulation. I want to highlight a couple more pieces of the history of violence that would help us understand that a case was higher risk. Stalking is associated with homicide. Campbell found that the risk was double. I suspect it's higher than this, and part of that is because I think a lot of stalking is unbeknownst to the victim, and so we know that it's a factor. It's at least 2 times the rate of other cases. The next bucket talks about the violence changing. So the violence could be escalating, and by that we mean getting more severe or happening more often, or it could be getting different, or it could be getting generalized. So if you just think of this factor as the violence is changing. So when you look at Adam's work with the women who were almost killed in his study, 85% of those women said that leading up to the near-fatal attack, the violence became more unpredictable. And 3/4 of those women said it got scarier or more bizarre. So the violence was changing. Adams found that in half of the men he talked to who had completed a homicide, they were also now threatening other people, threatening to kill her friends, her family, so their violence was becoming more generalized. And then Campbell, of course, has just established that when the violence is getting more severe or frequent, there is a higher risk for homicide. Last but not least, guns obviously make everything more dangerous in these situations. So we know that 2/3 of these homicides happen with a gun. That's true in Ohio every year. ODVN studies this. We watch it, and it just doesn't change. Sometimes it's a little higher, but it's always at least 2/3. And that's kind of it's not an uncommon percentage around the country. And then when we get into men or women who are committing murder-suicides, almost all of those happen with a gun. So guns make this situation more dangerous. Some people will ask us, well, wouldn't it be better if these women all went out and armed themselves? And, my response is to look at this data. A gun in this house is just going to make it worse. Christy Bice had a gun in her hand while she was laying dead on her living room floor. She just didn't get the shot off. And so the idea that guns make this better, in general is just not borne out by the data. So that's our first sort of column there. That's the history of violence. Those are the factors out of all the things abusers do. Those are the things that we know have an associated risk with homicide. Okay, let's talk about the abuser's mental state. So most domestic violence abusers are undetectable among us. We work with them. We go fishing with them. We play cards with them. We go to cookouts with them. We live next door to them, and they are undetected. If you think about most coverage of domestic violence homicides, the neighbors will almost invariably say, he was such a nice guy, we just can't believe he was capable of this. So these are not people who are running around, actively psychotic, having, severe mental health problems. It's just not what we find. However, some abusers are depressed and suicidal, and that factor is heavily associated with a risk for homicide. So I always, I want people to remember a depressed abuser is a very dangerous abuser. In Georgia, we found, just with public data, we didn't have, the ability to interview all the surviving family members of the 60 homicides we studied. But we found that 38% we could track a tie to suicide, and Campbell found it in her research as well. So if the survivor is telling you that the partner has talked about killing him or herself, we have to understand that as a higher risk for homicide. And that is a little counterintuitive, by the way, to the victim. And so you may be the only person who brings to her attention, hey, I know you're really worried about your partner because they're talking about hurting themselves, but actually they have a higher risk of hurting you seriously or killing you because they're depressed or suicidal. That's very valuable information that a survivor may not know because it's not the logical way we would think about it. Substance abuse can make these cases more dangerous. I know we all know that substance abuse doesn't cause domestic violence, but it can certainly escalate it. Campbell found it to be a factor. Adams found that in 2/3 of the men that he studied, the substance abuse was getting pretty serious. Jealousy and obsession, again, some of these factors are so common that you have to really you're really listening for the details. But what we're talking about here are people who have high levels of jealousy and obsession. When Adams interviewed the men who killed, 3/4 of them said that they became really obsessed with her in the days leading up to killing her. So just, again, listening for the severity of it. It's a common feature in all these relationships, but if somebody is excessively jealous and obsessed with the survivor, there seems to be a higher risk. Excuse me. A couple more about the abuser. Isolated and unemployed abusers have a higher associated risk with homicide. This one's a little tricky because you could take it to mean that it's low-income men, and that's not necessarily the case. But it is men who are out of employment at the time. There does seem to be a correlation there. For example, Steve Bice. Steve Bice was a truck driver. He made good money until his substance abuse problem became so serious he couldn't work anymore. So that unemployment and that lack of connection to other people, to the community, to self-worth, to earning power, all those things we think might be what's at play in this factor, but it's definitely a risk factor. Highly controlling abusers are also really, really more dangerous. And by highly controlling, we're talking about people who are telling their partner what to wear, what to cook, what to eat, when to eat, if they can eat, if they're allowed to use the phone, if they're allowed to work. These are the people that are checking the odometer on the car. These are the people who are, tracking her use of the phone. They're putting a, GPS. They're putting a low jack on the car. They've got a computer program where they can see where she's gone. I've talked to women who say that, the food has to be alphabetized in the refrigerator. The clothing in the closet has to be organized by color. I mean, these are people who are highly, highly controlling of many aspects of the victim's life. And so that, when you start to hear that, that's definitely an abuser who has a higher risk of homicide. This last group is really information that David Adams uncovered in his work. It was before not thought of or discussed very much, because we tend to talk about abusers who kill their partners or seriously injure their partners or their families as people who have sort of nothing left to lose. You know, if I can't have her, nobody will have her. I can't live without her. But Adams found a subset. It's a smaller group of men, and particularly he's talking about males who commit domestic violence homicide, who seem to be materially motivated. So, you know, it was about the survivor being an inconvenience, not being financially useful anymore. They were battering her. They were using coercive control and doing all the things that abusers do. But for them, this group of men, they had excessively negative views of women and saw women as really only there to serve. And the homicides seemed to stem from just, I didn't need her anymore. And maybe, I think some of them actually had new partners, if I remember correctly. So, you know, sort of the sociopathic kind of a person. And it's an interesting subset to pay attention to, because we use the stereotype which usually fits of this really dependent person, but it could be this kind of person too, who's just doesn't see her as a real person and doesn't see her as useful to him anymore. So that's those are the factors that we look at when we think about the abuser's mental state. You'll see there's nothing there about psychosis or thought disorders. Those do not make people, domestic violence offenders, more dangerous. So the next column, the next factors have to do with intervention. And the analogy that I'll offer that will make this make sense is drunk driving. So I'm going to age myself here a little bit and say I was raised in the 70s, and in the 70s, most people, it was very acceptable to drive under the influence of alcohol in our country, and not wear seatbelts either. And we didn't do a lot about that even when it was discovered, even when people wrecked their cars. We didn't have the mindset in the courts that we have now, which is this is a serious behavior. It's a threat to the public health. We're going to fine you. We're going to put you in a program. We're going to eventually take away your license. You know, we have a sequence of sanctions for drunk driving, and as well sort of a social value in our country that it's not cool anymore to sit in a bar for 2 hours and then go get in your car. So we don't do that around domestic violence yet, not completely. We certainly are doing so much better. But it's still pretty easy to have the cops called on you for abusing your family and not get arrested. And what Campbell found is for the people who are able to avoid arrest and consequences, they have much higher risks of eventually committing a homicide. So they basically get by, get over, and figure this isn't that big of a deal. Nobody's going to stop me. And, you know, when you look at Steve Bice's case, they did arrest and charge him, but then the prosecutor's office pled it down to disorderly conduct. And then even when he was subsequently violating the protection order repeatedly, nobody did anything. And so, you know, they didn't help him. He's also deceased, and they certainly didn't help the rest of the family. She's gone, the children are motherless. And so when people are able to slide through our systems without any accountability, you know, this isn't really about punishment. It's about trying to stop people, trying to get their attention, trying to help them understand that they've really crossed a line and that they're at risk of escalating. So in these cases where we see multiple prior calls to the police, history of violating protection orders, ability to avoid consequences, that's where that's a real common profile. Not always, but it's a very common profile for a big subset of these cases where there's a homicide after that. Next, I want to talk about separation, which is a concept, I guess. You know, many years ago, we used to say that almost all domestic violence homicide happened during separation. And I think we've gotten a little more sophisticated about what that means exactly, and so I want to tease that out for you a little bit. So Campbell finds, and this is the highest factor, 9 times, 900% higher rates, so people who are separating are more likely to be killed, and often killed, you know, at some point during that separation process. And Adams found that, almost 40% of the men he studied, their partner had separated and gotten a protection order against them. So separation in the traditional sense of leaving definitely is a risk factor. But what we uncovered in Georgia when we started interviewing families, so for the first couple years of our project and our study, we did not have access to the families, and then we set up a protocol and brought in some mental health people so that we could responsibly interview homicide survivors and give them the support they needed. And when we started talking to the surviving families of the homicide victims that we were studying, what we found was if they hadn't separated, they sure were planning on it. And it appeared to us, although we will never know for sure, that the abuser figured out that something was different. So many of these people had called a hotline, called legal aid, saved money, talked to friends or family about leaving. So they, there was this middle ground of separation, which, she hadn't physically left yet, or he hadn't left yet, because we did study a couple of male homicides, but they were on mentally that's where they were going, and they were starting to do things towards that goal. And then the last place on the continuum around separation has to do with the abuser realizing my partner's not coming back. This is really over. So when you think about separating as the victim's movement towards complete independence and the abuser's complete loss of control, then this one kind of makes sense. So if we go to this little chart, this little flow chart I made on the next slide, Carrie. So when we think about to the far left, okay, somebody who's thinking about leaving, we found many of those in Georgia. So somebody saving money, calling a hotline, telling family. I just did some expert work on a case with the prosecutor's office down in Cincinnati, and they were, in that case, she hadn't left, but she had seen her family the weekend before the homicide and told them that he was scaring her and that she wanted to come home, and they had told her, you can come home. Now, did she go back home from that visit to her husband or boyfriend and tell him that? Did she just start acting different? We don't know. But we saw a lot of these cases also in Georgia where there was something happening in the mind of the survivor, and behaviorally they were starting to move towards leaving, but they hadn't left yet, and then there was a homicide. So the consequence for us who are talking to people who are thinking about leaving is that we have to tell them, you've got to be careful. You can't, until you're out of there and you're in a safe place, you can't let on, what your plan is. And then in this middle ground, we have people who've left. They go to friends, they go to shelter, they file charges, those sort of early movements out of and away from the abuser. But on the far right, I really want us to focus, too, on these people, because sometimes I think these survivors think that they're safe when they're not. So it's really over sort of category. So I worked with a woman who so she filed charges in February. It's the woman I was just talking about where the abuser said on that 911 call, if I'm going to jail, I'm going to jail for a reason. So in that case, she left. They separated in February. She filed criminal charges. She got a temporary protection order as part of the prosecution. They ordered him out of the house. She stayed in the house with the kids, changed the locks, did all kinds of safety planning at her job. He started violating that order. She'd continue to call the police. They would file new charges, and they would release him on his own recognizance. And that happened many times over the spring until she finally stopped calling, because he was sitting on her back porch and sleeping and crying and leaving flowers and being very pitiful, and people didn't really, this is a case from a long time ago, they didn't really understand that behavior in the way that we might look at it now. So she was way past separation, right? They as a couple had not lived together for 5 months. She had all these criminal cases pending, but then she went and got a 5-year order. And then he walked into the house and slit her throat and killed her in front of her kids. And we believe that her going to get that civil protection order was a new signal to him that she was really, really, really not coming back. So it could be that the survivor files for divorce. It could be the survivor moves out of state. Unfortunately, what we see a lot in the cases we study here in Ohio, the survivor changes a Facebook post to "in a new relationship." We've seen a number of those be the catalyst for the homicide because that abuser really thought she's going to come back. So we want to talk with people. I was doing some safety planning with a woman who hasn't seen her husband. They've been separated for a couple of years now. And I asked her, I said, do you think, and she's in a new relationship, and she has a baby. And I said, do you think he's still looking at your Facebook page? And she said, yeah, I do. And I said, so then you can't post about this baby. You can't post about this new relationship because we never know how long an abuser might be holding on to this illusion that the separation is going to end and that the person is going to come home. So separation is a tricky thing. It's a longer continuum than maybe we thought before. Last set of factors have to do with the survivor themselves. The first factor is just, does the survivor believe that their partner is going to kill them? And, you know, most survivors are experts at their own situation, and they have a really good sense about the danger that they're in. So if somebody tells you, I think my partner is going to kill me, we can pretty much take that to the bank as a high-risk case. The tricky thing is that, as we all know, trauma can create some complicating responses in people, and they can engage in denial and minimization. And so sometimes a person can be in a really dangerous situation, and they're just not thinking about it all the time because they're just trying to get through the day, and they may be minimizing how bad things are. So the survivor's assessment matters. It can't be the only assessment, but it certainly matters. Survivors we're working with who have some sort of impairment to their ability to do a safety plan, and this could be prescription drugs, substance abuse, depression, post-traumatic stress, could be cognitive barriers. So somebody who just may have some difficulty carrying out a safety plan could be at higher risk, we believe. Even though this has not been studied, we certainly see some of these people among survivors who are killed. People who are isolated, survivors who are isolated, who have limited money, have language barriers, they live in a rural area, they can't get to a safe place, certainly have a higher risk of homicide. And the last one, which popped up in Jackie Campbell's research, is that if the survivor we're talking with is herself or himself depressed and suicidal, they are still at higher risk of homicide. So this one is complicated. One piece we should know, just as an aside, is that survivors commit suicide at a rate about 3 times of people who are not living with domestic violence. So, 3 times higher than the rate of homicides that are committed against them. So suicide is something we should be listening for anyway with survivors. But when Jackie Campbell looked at women who were killed by their partners, these people had a much higher rate of depression and suicide themselves. One survivor I talked to, who's now a shelter director, told me, she said that when I was in my relationship towards the very end, before I finally escaped, she said I was very depressed. I thought about killing myself all the time, and I got really sloppy, and I taunted him, and I did stuff that I knew would make things worse because I didn't care anymore. And so we just don't know why this factor is there, but it's definitely something that's associated with a higher risk of homicide. So there's the chart, all the factors together, and you can. It's also an attachment that you can download and print if it's useful to you in any way in terms of, turning it into a checklist or just questions that you want to be sure you ask people about their battering history. There are shorter lists, so there's a thing called the Maryland homicide risk assessment that some police departments use because officers may not have the ability to stand there and take this kind of history. So I guess whatever you can work into your work, and I would certainly focus on those risk factors that I highlighted that have the higher rates of, the higher levels of risk. But again, thinking about the Christy Bice case and others, we want to just listen for all the factors, and it might just be one that gives you a really bad feeling, and so you want to listen to that. So as we're sort of closing, I want to make sure there's time for questions. Even though we'll be doing it through the chat box, I want to make sure we're applying this. I want to end with sort of the now what question. So you have this maybe enhanced understanding of how risk is higher in some cases, and so now what? And if you're not a domestic violence advocate, what do you do with that information? So I just gave you a slide to give you some possible ways to talk with people. So these are the things I usually say to people. You know, I say, I'm worried for you. I'm concerned for your safety or for your kids. I always say to people, you deserve to be safe. This isn't, you know, you don't deserve to be looking over your shoulder worried about whether you're going to live or not. Sometimes when people tell me their history and I'm hearing these really, really, high danger factors, I'll say, you know, I'm hearing things that you're telling me that you're going through, and I have to tell you, some of these things indicate that your abuser is potentially very dangerous. I don't want to say to somebody, oh my gosh, I think you're going to be killed, but at the same time, I don't want to soft pedal this. Survivors need the information we have about these risk factors. They may or may not know how all these things come together, so we have to tell them when we hear it. Always want to ask them if they're willing to talk to an advocate to develop a safety plan. And an important piece of information is that last bullet, to tell survivors you don't have to go to a shelter to get support and to do a safety plan. Most people that domestic violence programs serve at this point aren't in shelter. They're on hotlines, they're out in courtrooms, they're out in community outreach projects. So they can call a hotline and say, I don't feel safe, my partner's hurting me, I need to develop a safety plan with somebody, and that can be done. If they don't find that their local program is supportive, or they don't want to call their local program for some reason, there is a national domestic violence hotline that you can Google and provide that number. But safety plans are one of the important pieces to getting people closer to safety, even though we can't individually stop an abuser who's intent on killing his partner or her partner. There's a lot we can do through safety planning, and some of that might include using other systems to try to help the survivor get safer. And there's finally, I gave you a link on that slide, which just is a place that you can get onto our website to get the number for the closest domestic violence program to you and your campus. There is a domestic violence program who serves every county in the state of Ohio. So there's somebody around who can do safety planning and support with people. So I want to take some time here at the end to just ask, is this information helpful? How would it work in your setting? Are there things you want to clarify? Any question is a good question, just to try to make this as helpful to you as possible. You can type those in the chat box.
So while we're waiting, Nancy, maybe as people may be thinking of questions to include or whatnot, I already see one note about this being a really great webinar, so thank you. I wanted to just ask you, what are some of the challenges you've seen maybe, or the ODVN has seen? I know that some of our campuses that feel very strongly that they can do effective safety planning, and some of them may be, but what are some of the common maybe pitfalls or things that campuses maybe need to check themselves on in terms of their capabilities or their resources to really help a survivor craft a safety plan?
Well, I guess what I would say is I think that a campus resource can do a great job at a lot of the pieces of safety planning, which have to do with helping people understand their risk, helping people think about how they can make a plan to exit. Sometimes, though, I guess what I would say is if the safety plan is going to rely on using other community resources like calling the police, like trying to get a protection order, like trying to go to the shelter, like trying to get custody of the kids, like trying to enforce a protection order, if as a campus advocate or campus resource you're not in those systems every day, it's going to be harder for you to direct that survivor to the right resource and to the right person within that resource, and to really be able to predict for that survivor how that resource really works and to help that survivor when that system doesn't respond. So, for example, if I would have been an advocate in the Christy Bice case, law enforcement did a lot of really good stuff in this case, but then at the end, they kind of didn't take him seriously. He called her 9 times in 30 minutes in violation of a protection order. And I feel very badly for the officer because he noted, I'm going to have to go pick him up tomorrow. But, as an advocate in a community, if I was working in that community, I would have known who to call. If she would have called me and said, look, he just called me 9 times in 30 minutes. He's heavily intoxicated. The police are not going to do anything. I would probably have known the name of a sergeant or lieutenant who I had a relationship with, who I could call to try to get that problem solved. So I think that may be a limitation, or not, but it might be a limitation for some campus advocates. So those community relationships and just how things work in the various systems might be some stuff that your DV advocate partners can bring to the process that you start.
Great, thank you so much. And just as a reminder to everybody, on the 17th of this month, we'll be talking about barriers to leaving. I believe there will be some touching upon a little bit more of safety planning in that piece, but also too on the 24th this month, there will be the last webinar in this series talking about coordinating campus and community responses to lend to Nancy's point about how do we all work together to best support survivors on our campus, not just with safety planning, but certainly that is a component, but making sure we're all working together. So I encourage you all, if you don't have those dates already on your calendar, to please make sure that you do. I will have the link to the webinars up at least 48 hours in advance of those dates. So I have not seen any other questions. We'll do a last call, I guess, to anybody who might have one. I've noticed a couple of people asking about a copy of this webinar, so let me share it with others on their campus. I've provided my email address. You can just email me directly, and I will be happy to send you a link to this webinar today for you to review, maybe at a later time just yourself, or I would definitely encourage you to share this with others on your campus where you think it might be helpful. Nancy, you mentioned earlier some training opportunities, certainly with Ruth and the strangulation piece. I've known Ruth for several years, even back when I was working on campus, and she is phenomenal.
She is.
And she's just been a real advocate for the strangulation piece in the state, I know. And you guys just honored her this past year.
We did.
We did. Yes.
We did. Well, the other thing I was...
Go ahead.
I was just going to suggest the other thing that you can do is on our website, odvn.org, there's a tab for training, and so you can see our training schedule for the year, and anybody can come to our trainings. And we also have a lot of e-learning sessions on our website, and you can also email us and get on our listserv and find out about other training opportunities that some of our state and national partners put on. So there's lots of opportunities to stay in the conversation, and for us to possibly even come and do a training on your campus with people, or we might be doing a training event close to you. So please use this as a resource to support your work.
Definitely, and I know you guys have partnered with, and also Sandy Hunsinger over at the crime victim section at the AG's office, and covered some of these same topics. And I know some of you on this call have been to some of those trainings as well. So I would definitely, we've got amazing partners and people in this state. So just really would encourage you, if you know there's a topic your campus you really want to touch upon with your campus law enforcement or security, or just others, coaches, residence hall staff, counseling staff, health center staff, any of the others alike, just really would encourage you guys to take advantage of the Ohio Domestic Violence Network and or other resources in the state and their trainings, as Nancy just talked about. So still not seeing any questions. Nancy, thank you so much.
Sure
your
thing.
expertise and your time today has just been invaluable, and I really appreciate it, and I know many others do too. So want to say thank you to you, and thank you to all of you who did join us today. Really appreciate you giving of your time to learn more on this important topic and tap in. I know Nancy's provided her contact information should you have specific questions regarding your campus for her or whatnot. So I would encourage you to contact her if you need to directly. So without further ado, I will say thank you to everybody and have a great rest of your day.